my name is Payam Zamani, and I was born in Tehran, but we actually lived somewhere outside of Tehran in a little place called Kalak, which is close to Karaj. And I grew up in many different cities and small towns in Iran. Growing up, my parents, they were, it was their life's goal to pioneer and live in many different places in the country. So as a result, we lived in many different cities, and it was unlikely for me to go to the same school for more than 1 year and get a chance to go, to the same school and enjoy the same friends for a couple of years in a row. A place that particularly, I think, had a big impact on me was a town that we lived in twice. Once when I was very young, till I was about 5, and then once later on after the revolution.
Around what year was your memory of the first time you were there?
So I was born in 1971, and we lived in Hashgerd. The first time that we lived there was in the early 70s. For a few years, we lived in Hashgerd.
So at the time of the revolution, you were about 8 years old?
Exactly. I was about 80 years old at the time of the revolution in 1979.
And this was before the revolution?
This was before the revolution. So by the time, from the time that I was about 1.5 years old till I was about 5 years old, we lived in this town. And the name of the town was Hashgerd, which is outside of Karaj, between Karaj and Qazvin, about 75 kilometers from Tehran. And in that town, now I was very small at that point, and so I remember a few things about the time we lived there in the early 70s, but there's some that definitely stand out in my mind. One of the things that I will never forget is living in the house that we had, which was literally about 300 feet from the police office or gendarmerie in Iran. And but every night people would break our windows. And imagine I'm 5 years old, and every night we sit down to have our dinner, and the stones are thrown at our house, and the windows are broken. This was during the Shah's regime.
Years before the revolution, let's say 54, right?
Exactly, yes. And so we had the way that the rooms in the house were set up. There was a bigger room, and then there was like walls that did not completely separate it from the room behind it. And so we would actually sit behind those half walls, in a sense, to have our dinner, so glass would not end up in our food. And this basically literally happened all the time. And we would go to gendarmerie, and we would go to the police, and we would complain about this, and the response typically was, well, move. You don't have to live here. Go to Tehran. Live somewhere else so people don't bother you. They would never say that, well, we'll do something about it. We'll try to get the neighbors stop, breaking your windows. And the stores in town, they would not sell us stuff either. So it was very common for my mom to go to the local butcher shop, and they would say that we're not going to sell you meat. Or go to the mini mart and ask for milk, and they will not sell us milk. So as a result, they would do everything possible to make life very difficult for us. And my dad worked in Tehran, so in the morning he would leave, and my brother and sister, they would go to school, and they would typically come back beaten up pretty badly. They were older than me, so they went to school. I did not at the time. So the life went on, living in Hashgerd till 1976, that we decided to go pioneering to India. And we left, went to India, stayed there for less than a year, and came back, partly because India would not give us permanent residency. But it was at least interesting to experience a country that you were completely free to talk about your religion and practice it however you wanted. Came back to Iran, and then we moved up to the northern part of Iran, close to Gorgan. We lived in a town called Aliabad. In that town, close to that town, there was another small town. I don't remember the name, but recently they had killed a Baha'i with an axe. a handicapped Baha'i who was in his wheelchair.
This is still under.
This is still during Shah's regime.
76, 77.
Exactly, 77. And they had gone to this man's home, either Taimur or Taimuri, and they had killed him with an axe, a gentleman handicapped in a wheelchair. And we went and visited the house, and the bloodstains were still there. And, and my dad was never content finding a place that was peaceful for us to live. He was looking for places that were always, not treating Baha'is fairly. So my sister there was a hit and run that they tried to kill my sister for being a Baha'i, and her and two of her other Baha'i friends, all in Gorgan in the town called Ali Abad. Her and her two friends, they ended up in a hospital, and they survived. One of them ended up in coma, but anyhow, all three of them survived. We lived there for about a year, and frankly, life there was very difficult. We went back to Tehran, and when we went back to Tehran, that's about the time of the revolution. We lived in Tehran when the revolution happened, and then we moved back to Ashgard. We moved back to Ashgard in 1980 or 81, and I was in 5th grade when we moved back.
So it's right after the revolution. You're basically 13, 14 years old.
I was 10 years old when we moved back.
No, when, I see, 81.
Exactly, 80, 81. The war had just started with Iraq. And in 81, I went to 11th grade. To 6th grade. I was 11 years old. And Ashgard had become even more difficult of a place. People were fanatical. They had even become less tolerant when it became to, as far as Baha'is were concerned, even less tolerant than before the revolution. Before the revolution, it was very difficult to live there. And in 6th grade, middle school, there was me and another Baha'i kid in the school that I went to, and they had prayers every morning at noon, and they would ask all the kids to join those public prayers. And they had asked us also, and we said we are Baha'is, we have our own prayers, so we do our own thing, and thank you, though, very respectful about it. One day, as they were having their prayer during lunchtime, the friend and I, we were watching them from a classroom, and the person who gave the sermon, which every school had one of these people at the time who was responsible for Islamic teachings at schools in Iran, during his sermon, he said that today we're going to get rid of the Baha'i kids. And it was a big school. I don't know exactly how many students, but hundreds of students, maybe 500 students. And when the school ended that day, we saw that there were kids gathering outside the school, and they were waiting for us with sticks, with rock, whatever they could find. As the teachers were leaving, we asked a few of them if they would give us a ride and get us out of this situation. And of course, nobody was willing to do that. So everybody was gone. There was us and a mob of probably 100 outside of the school. And I'm 11, the friend of mine was 12. And we waited for a while. We said, well, sooner or later, we have to deal with them, so we might as well get going. And we had about a mile walk from the school to our home. So we started the walk, and it's funny, when I think back, we were beaten up really, really badly for the entire duration of the walk, with sticks, with rocks, spit. I mean, so many people spit on us that by the time I got home, I was drenched, I was wet, head to toe, totally wet. And but I don't remember the pain. I don't remember the pain of getting beaten up, and I got beaten up really badly. I mean, I was bloody, but I don't remember any pain. And I remember that a few of the big rocks they threw at me and the friend of mine, hit their own, and there were a few of them who were bruised up pretty badly. But the bottom line is that we got home, and you can imagine, how my parents, felt about what had happened. But what do? Our house was viewed in that town as the embassy of Israel. Every time there was any kind of protest going on for the remembrance of the day of the revolution or whatever day that they were celebrating, they would come protest in front of our home. And so the mob gathered up and they were outside of our home, and there is the gendarmerie right next to our home, and nobody's willing to stop the crowd or do anything about it. I went inside the house, and I just remember that one thing my mom told me back then: wear your nicest clothes. When they kill us, we should look good. And that was it. They finally dispersed and went away, and the next day, my parents, they took me and the friend of mine, his parents also came along. We went to the office of, I guess, I don't know what they call it, I guess like the school district, their office, and to meet with the president for the school district. And the president finally showed up. He said, "What do you want from me?" And with a serious attitude, and my dad explained what had happened. He said, "And he's not dead." So, their goal was to kill him. He's not dead. And my dad said, "Well, we have human rights." And he said, "No, you don't. You're Baha'i, and basically you don't have any rights. You don't like it, you move to a different town." And that was the thing, that there was no question that at the highest level in Iran, they were doing everything they could to make life difficult for Baha'is. But still, the execution of it was different from one city to another, from one neighborhood to another. And this school district just happened to be one that they had chosen to cleanse themselves of Baha'is. And so they said that there is no school within this district that your kids can go to. So leave. And we ended up moving. Actually, I ended up living away from my parents for a few years. And then ultimately we ended up in Shiraz. And as luck would have it, and we had not done our research, we ended up moving to Shiraz literally days after 10 Baha'i girls were martyred. And we ended up moving to an area called Saadiyeh, which they had just burned down Baha'i homes. We bought a house right there. So imagine, months prior, they had burned down Baha'i homes, and we were the only Baha'i willing to go and buy a home there, but we had no idea what we were doing. And I lived in Iran till 1987, and ultimately in 1987, my parents decided that given that there's only one life for me to live, which was join the war, which was something that was required to do, which was fine. As a Baha'i, we would of course serve the country, and we don't want to carry arms, but we will serve the country. But the situation was as such: you didn't know if you're going to get shot from people in front of you or by the people behind you. And
this is right at the year of your last year of high school, basically.
11th grade.
11th grade.
Yes. So ultimately, in 1987, my parents said it was time for me to leave Iran. My brother had left the year prior. My sister had also left the year prior. And on July 7th, 1987, a smuggler took me from Zahedan to Pakistan. It was an ordeal that took about a week. I ended up in a town called Quetta, Pakistan, and there was me and a few other people that I didn't know. We did the journey together. And
how long you stayed for?
I was in Pakistan for a year, and then ultimately came to the U.S. in 1988, June of '88.
Thank you. That was great. Anything else you want to add?
I think that's pretty much it. For whatever it may be worth, my father, he had declared himself. He had become a Baha'i himself.
The first generation.
Yes, he had become a Baha'i in the 50s, late 50s, as a result of 1950s.
From being a Muslim.
Being a Muslim and having been born in a family of mullahs.
Explain why they picked them.
Yeah, exactly. In Sadeh, Isfahan, that's where he was born. And he had learned from his father many years prior that his father did not want him to go to school because he said if you go to school, you'll become a Babi. So my dad did not go to school till he was an adult. And then ultimately, he went to school later on after he left his family. And in late 50s, he heard Falsafi speaking on the radio and saying the kinds of things he did about the Baha'is. And he said, well, I want to learn about the Baha'i faith. What is this? And he learned about the Baha'i faith from Dr. Majzoub and Mr. Bakhtavar. And he, a couple of years later, became a Baha'i. And then he, of course, decided that he wanted to, pioneering was the way of life for him. And many years later, the year of Iran's revolution, we had gone to Isfahan to visit his family. And they were mourning a loss. And we asked him what has happened. And as it turned out, my father's cousin, first cousin, had been killed the week prior by a Muslim who had walked into his store and has said that I've decided to kill a Baha'i today. He was not a Baha'i, it's just that his cousin had become a Baha'i. And they assumed that that family, and they were a family of mullahs, I mean, they still are. So.
What did your father do?
My father, later on when he ended up going to school and finishing his school, he ended up working for the Department of Health. And in the 70s, he was on a task force that they were responsible for getting rid of malaria in Iran.
So. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.